No one talks about the sound. They remember the power, the name, the fear, the legacy. But history, real history, often pivots on something far smaller than a speech or a war. Sometimes it pivots on a single sound, a sharp breath, a finger tightening, a heartbeat stopping. And in this story, the sound that changed everything was the pull of a trigger at point-blank range. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what power means to you. Is it force, intelligence, fear, loyalty, or silence? And if you want to understand power beyond appearances, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay with me until the end, because what unfolds here is not about violence, but about control. Don Vito Corleone was never the loudest man in the room. He never needed to be. His power lived in pauses and measured words, in the way men lowered their eyes when he spoke. He understood something most never do. Chaos is noisy, authority is quiet. And on the day history shifted, Don Vito did not raise his voice. He simply nodded. The room was small, heavy with cigar smoke and expectation. The kind of room where decisions were not debated, only accepted. Outside, New York breathed as usual, unaware that the future of several families, alliances, and bloodlines was being decided in silence. Inside, a bodyguard stood close enough to feel Don Vito's breath, slow, steady, controlled. This man was not just muscle. He was loyalty given human form. Years of service had taught him when to watch, when to listen, and most importantly, when to act without being told. Don Vito never gave orders loudly. He trusted that those who truly belonged already understood. Across the table sat a man who had mistaken proximity for power. He believed that deals could be broken without consequence, that respect could be borrowed without being earned. His words kept coming, filling the space, unaware that he had already crossed a line that could not be redrawn. Don Vito listened. He always did, not because he needed information, but because listening reveals character. And as the man spoke, Vito saw exactly who he was, and what he would always be: a risk, a future problem, a fracture waiting to spread. The bodyguard noticed the shift before anyone else, a subtle change, not anger, not rage, something colder, final. Don Vito adjusted his hand on the armrest, a movement so small it could have meant nothing to an outsider. But to the man standing beside him, it meant everything. In that fraction of a second, the world narrowed, sound faded. The bodyguard felt the familiar weight of the weapon, not as an instrument of violence, but as a tool of decision. He did not hesitate. Hesitation was for men who doubted. He did not doubt Don Vito. He trusted him with his life, his future, his soul. The trigger was pulled at point-blank range. The sound was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was final. That sound ended more than a life. It ended a possibility. It erased a future where betrayal became common, where weakness spread unchecked. In the logic of Don Vito Corleone, mercy without boundaries was cruelty to the family, and the family above all else had to endure. No one screamed, no one ran. Fear did not explode. It settled. The room understood immediately what had happened and why. This was not chaos. This was order being restored. The bodyguard stepped back into stillness, his role complete, his face unreadable. He had not acted out of anger nor pleasure. He had acted out of duty. Don Vito remained seated. His expression did not change, because for him, this was not violence. It was maintenance. Just as a gardener removes a rotten branch to save the tree, he removed a threat to protect everything he had built. That single sound traveled far beyond that room. It moved through whispered conversation, altered negotiation, silenced ambitions before they were spoken. Men who heard about it understood something deeply unsettling. Don Vito Corleone did not bluff. When he listened, it was to decide, not to reconsider. And yet, what most never understood was that this moment was not about fear. It was about responsibility. Power in Vito's world came with a burden. Every decision echoed through generations. Every action shaped the future his children would inherit. The bodyguard knew this too. He carried the weight of that sound with him, long after the smoke cleared, because pulling the trigger was easy. Living with the meaning of it was not. And as the city continued its unaware rhythm outside those walls, a new balance settled into place. one that would demand loyalty, test honor, and redefine what it truly meant to protect a family. And that balance would soon be challenged in ways no one in that room could yet foresee. The days that followed carried an unusual calm, not peace, calm. The kind that settles after a storm when everyone is counting what still stands. News of what happened never appeared in papers, never reached headlines, yet it moved faster than truth ever could. It traveled through looks, through sudden changes of tone, through invitations that were quietly withdrawn and apologies that arrived without being requested. Don Vito understood this rhythm well. Power was not in repetition. A single, precise action echoed longer than 1,000 threats. He returned to his routines, meeting guests, listening to favors, offering advice that sounded gentle but carried absolute weight. To the outside world, nothing had changed. To those who mattered, everything had. The bodyguard remained close, as always. He said little, watched everything. Men often assumed that carrying a weapon was the source of his authority. They were wrong. His authority came from proximity, from being trusted to stand within arm's reach of a man whose life defined an empire. That trust was earned slowly, sealed in moments where silence mattered more than words. At night, when the house quieted, the sound returned to him. Not loud, never loud, just a brief rupture in time. He did not regret it. Regret implied doubt. What lingered instead was awareness, the understanding that one action could redirect countless lives. Some would prosper because of it. Others would disappear from the path entirely. Don Vito noticed the change in him. He noticed everything. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Vito spoke without turning his head. "You did what was necessary," he said, his voice calm, almost kind. "But necessity always asks for payment." The bodyguard did not respond. He knew better than to interrupt wisdom when it chose to speak. "Men think power is about being feared," Vito continued. "Fear is easy. Anyone can create it. What is difficult is restraint, knowing when to stop, knowing when not to act." The words were not a lesson. They were a reminder. Vito was not grooming a killer. He was shaping a guardian, someone who understood that violence was never the goal, only the boundary. Elsewhere in the city, others were drawing their own conclusions. Rivals debated whether the act signaled aggression or warning. Younger men, hungry for recognition, misread the silence as opportunity. They mistook patience for weakness, forgetting that Don Vito's greatest strength had always been time. A meeting was arranged, neutral ground, polite faces, careful language. The bodyguard stood behind Vito, sensing tension before it surfaced. He had learned that danger rarely announced itself. It crept in through confidence, through men who smiled too much and spoke too fast. As negotiations unfolded, Vito listened again. He allowed the other side to talk themselves into revealing more than they intended. Each word painted a clearer picture, not of the deal, but of the future. The bodyguard caught a glance, not a command, not yet, just acknowledgement. A reminder that trust still flowed both ways. This time, no weapon was needed. Vito dismantled ambition with sentences so measured they felt harmless. Concessions were offered that were not real. Promises were accepted that would never be kept. The meeting ended cordially, everyone convinced they had gained something. Only one side had. On the ride home, the bodyguard understood the deeper truth. The trigger had not been the turning point. It had been the punctuation. The real shift was in how the world now listened. Every word from Don Vito carried added weight, because men knew silence could follow, and silence could be permanent. That knowledge changed behavior. It sharpened loyalty. It filtered out recklessness. The family grew quieter, stronger, more deliberate. Still, power attracts challenge the way light attracts insects. And somewhere beyond the reach of loyalty and fear, someone was listening to the story of that sound, not with caution, but with curiosity. And curiosity in this world was often the first step toward conflict. The curiosity did not announce itself loudly. It never did. It moved through intermediaries, through men who claimed neutrality, through questions disguised as admiration. Someone wanted to know who stood closest to Don Vito. Someone wanted to understand how a single sound could realign an entire city without a single follow-up act of violence. The bodyguard felt it before it became visible. Subtle shifts in how strangers looked at him, a fraction of a second longer, a calculation behind polite nods. He had become part of the story, whether he wanted to or not. Not a name, but a symbol, proof that Don Vito's reach extended beyond words. One afternoon, as Vito received guests in his study, a messenger arrived unannounced. That alone was unusual. The message was brief, respectful, carefully written, an invitation to talk. Not a demand, not a threat. An invitation from someone who understood the language of power well enough to avoid mistakes. Don Vito read it once, then handed it back without comment. His eyes lifted slowly. "They are testing the edges," he said. "They want to know if the sound was an exception or a rule." The bodyguard remained still. He understood now that restraint did not mean inactivity. It meant choosing the battlefield. The meeting took place days later in a location chosen for its symbolism rather than security. Old walls, quiet history, a place that reminded men of what lasted longer than ambition. The bodyguard scanned the room instinctively, measuring exits, distances, intentions. But something felt different. The man who arrived was calm, too calm. He spoke with precision, complimented Don Vito's legacy, acknowledged the balance that had been restored. He did not challenge the past. He questioned the future. "Power changes hands," he said evenly. "Even the most respected ones." Don Vito did not interrupt. Silence stretched, forcing the man to continue. "And those closest to power," he added, glancing briefly toward the bodyguard, "often become its weakest link." The air tightened, not with anger, but with possibility. This was not an insult. It was an offer wrapped in warning. Don Vito smiled faintly, not because he was amused, but because clarity had arrived. "You misunderstand something," he said. "Those closest to me are not leverage. They are proof." The man leaned back, studying the bodyguard now openly, measuring loyalty the way others measured money. Later, when the meeting ended without resolution, Don Vito walked slowly toward the car. The city lights reflected off the pavement like fragments of broken mirrors. "Do you know why I trust you?" Vito asked quietly. The bodyguard did not answer. "Because you never confuse importance with ambition," Vito continued. "Men who want to be seen make mistakes. Men who want to serve see everything." That night, the bodyguard realized the danger was no longer external. The sound had changed history, yes, but it had also drawn attention to the hand that created it. And some men believed that removing the hand would silence the power behind it. Plans began to shift. Routes changed. Meetings shortened. The family tightened inward. Loyalty was tested not through words, but through patience. Some passed, others did not. And somewhere in the dark, a decision was forming, one that would not involve negotiation and would not be corrected with words alone. The bodyguard sensed it the same way he had sensed everything else. Before it happened, before it was spoken, before it became inevitable. Because history does not repeat itself loudly. It waits. The waiting ended on an ordinary morning, the kind that lowers defenses because it feels familiar. Sunlight filtered through curtains. Routines unfolded as they always had, and yet something beneath the surface had shifted. The bodyguard felt it in his chest before his mind caught up. A tension without source, a warning without shape. The route had been changed twice. The schedule adjusted. Precautions layered over precautions. Still, danger does not need opportunity. It only needs belief. As they moved through the street, the city sounded the same. Cars, voices, footsteps. Normality was its camouflage. The bodyguard walked half a step behind Don Vito, eyes moving, senses open. He noticed the man across the street pause too long. The vehicle that slowed without reason. Small details, meaningless alone, fatal together. There was no panic, no sudden rush, just clarity. He stepped closer to Don Vito, adjusting position as if by habit. In that movement, he absorbed the first impact meant for someone else. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but pain was information, not distraction. He turned, already acting, already deciding. The second sound echoed differently than the first one weeks earlier. This one was not about order. It was about protection. The weapon discharged, close, controlled, final. The attacker fell before fear could spread. People screamed then. Chaos followed. but it arrived late, too late to matter. The bodyguard stayed upright long enough to ensure Don Vito was untouched. Only then did his strength begin to fade. As he fell, he felt hands catch him, voices calling his name, the world narrowing again. Later, in a quiet room filled with hushed urgency, Don Vito stood beside the bed. The machines hummed softly, indifferent to legacy, honor, or power. For a long moment he said nothing. "You see," he finally spoke, voice low, steady, "this is why power is never personal." The bodyguard's eyes opened briefly. He tried to speak. Vito raised a hand. "You already said everything," he said. "With your actions." The attempt on Don Vito's life failed, but its message was clear. Someone had crossed from curiosity into conviction, from observation into action, and that shift demanded response. Not loud, not immediate, but inevitable. Within days, the city recalibrated again, not through visible retaliation, but through absence. Certain meetings never happened. Certain names stopped circulating. Certain ambitions quietly dissolved. Men understood that the line had not moved, it had hardened. Don Vito visited the bodyguard daily, not as a boss, not as a symbol, as a man honoring another man who had carried the weight of decisions few ever saw. "You protected the family," Vito said once. "That is all history will need to know." But history, as always, would only hear fragments, whispered, the sound, the silence that followed. And as the bodyguard recovered, weaker in body but unchanged in spirit, both men understood that the story was nearing its true conclusion, not with another shot, but with a lesson that would outlive them both. Because legacies are not written by how power is taken, but by what is protected when power is tested. Recovery was slow, measured in small victories most men would overlook. A steady breath, a hand that no longer trembled, the ability to stand without assistance. The bodyguard never complained. He never asked how close he had come to dying. He already knew. Survival was not a miracle. It was consequence, the result of choices made long before the street, long before the sound. Don Vito watched him with the same patience he applied to everything else. Power had taught him many things, but age had refined them. Strength faded. Reputation shifted. Only character remained untouched by time. "You did not hesitate," Vito said one afternoon as they sat in silence. "That is rare. Most men hesitate when the cost becomes personal." The bodyguard met his eyes. "It was always personal," he replied quietly. Vito nodded. That answer mattered more than any oath. Word spread as it always did, but differently now. The story was no longer just about a trigger pulled at point-blank range. It was about a man who stood between power and consequence. A man who understood that loyalty was not blind obedience, but informed devotion. He knew exactly what he was protecting and why. The families adjusted. Younger men learned restraint instead of bravado. Older men rediscovered patience. Deals were made with fewer words and more understanding. The city did not grow quieter because of fear, but because clarity had returned. Don Vito's health declined, as all things eventually do, but his mind remained sharp, his values unchanged. He spent more time at home, surrounded by those he trusted. The bodyguard was always nearby, no longer just a shield, but a presence, a reminder of what the family stood for. One evening, as the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the room, Vito spoke again. "People will remember the sound," he said. "They always do. They will think that is where history turned." He paused, then continued. "But history turns long before that. It turns in silence, in decisions no one applauds, in restraint no one sees." The bodyguard understood then what the sound truly represented. Not violence, not fear, certainty. A moment when indecision died so something greater could survive. When Don Vito Corleone finally passed, the city mourned in its own quiet way. No monuments, no speeches, just an absence that could not be filled. Men who had once challenged him now spoke his name with respect. Those who had misunderstood him never spoke it at all. The bodyguard attended the funeral standing where he always had, close, watchful, silent. His role was nearly complete, but the lesson remained. Power does not shout. It does not rush. It does not need to explain itself. And sometimes history is not changed by wars, speeches, or revolutions, but by a single sound followed by years of silence that teach the world how to listen. That is how legacies endure, not through noise, but through meaning.